They were going to kill him at 8 in the morning. Not because he was rabid, not because he was wild, but because no one understood what he was still fighting. In a dusty shelter yard in New Mexico, a Belgian Malinois slammed his body against a steel cage, not barking, not growling, but scanning the sky like mortars were about to fall. To everyone else, he was a monster. To Franklin, he was a soldier. And Franklin knew that look. He'd seen it in Kandahar, in men who came home but never really left the war. The county had given the dog 7 days before the needle. Franklin had 168 hours to do the impossible. Convince a broken war dog that the war was over, or watch him die. The morning air in Taos, New Mexico did not just bite, it gnawed. It was a dry, abrasive cold that carried the scent of oxidized iron-stale diesel and the bitter tang of sagebrush crushed under heavy tires. At the edge of the county animal shelter, a facility that looked more like a graveyard for lost hopes than a sanctuary, the silence of the desert was shattered by a sound that made the marrow in one's bones ache. It was the rhythmic, violent slamming of a body against a steel cage accompanied by a guttural roar that wasn't quite a bark and wasn't quite a scream. It was the sound of a living thing trying to tear its way out of its own skin. David, a veteran animal control officer who had long ago traded his compassion for a thick layer of cynicism, stood 5 feet from the transport lunge. His uniform was torn at the shoulder, and a crimson stain bloomed across his forearm, dripping rhythmically into the sand. His breath came in ragged white plumes. In his right hand he gripped a catch-pole like a spear, and in his left he held a radio, his voice cracking as he demanded the immediate arrival of the vet with a sedative, or better yet, the pink liquid that brought the permanent sleep. He had seen mean dogs, but this German shepherd, a massive beast with fur the color of winter smoke and eyes that burned with a terrifying lucidity, was something else. It wasn't just aggressive, it was tactical. The dog launched itself again. The metal bars of the transport crate groaned under the impact. The animal's ears were pinned back so tightly they seemed to disappear into its skull, and its lips were pulled back to reveal gums that were white with fury. Every time a shadow passed overhead, a crow, a drifting cloud, a plastic bag caught in the wind, the dog would twist its body mid-air, snapping at the sky with a desperate, frantic precision. To the onlookers, it was the erratic behavior of a rabid animal. To the crowd of shelter volunteers cowering behind the fence, it was a monster that needed to be put down before it broke the latch. A rusted Ford F-150, its engine coughing like a dying man, rolled to a stop a few yards away. The door creaked open, and Franklin stepped out. He was a man who seemed to be made of the same hard earth as the mountains surrounding the town. For 15 years, he had lived in a cabin where the cell service didn't reach, and the only conversations he had were with the wind. He wore a heavy canvas jacket stained with grease and a pair of boots that had seen more miles than most cars. He didn't move toward the commotion immediately. He stood by his truck, the scent of the dog's fear reaching him before the sound did. It was a scent he hadn't smelled since the dust of Afghanistan had filled his lungs. David yelled at him to stay back, his voice a mix of pain and warning. The officer was preparing the syringe now, his hands shaking as he realized the dog was beginning to bend the gate of the cage. The crowd held its breath, expecting a bloodbath. But Franklin didn't listen. He walked forward with a slow, rhythmic gait that suggested he wasn't moving toward a threat, but toward a memory. His eyes, a piercing, haunted blue, were locked onto the dog. He didn't look at the teeth. He didn't look at the blood on David's arm. He looked at the way the dog's haunches were coiled and how its gaze flickered upward every 3 seconds. As Franklin got closer, the world around him began to blur. The sound of the Taos wind transformed into the rhythmic thumping of rotor blades. The smell of diesel became the stench of burning JP-8 fuel. He wasn't in New Mexico anymore. He was back in the Kandahar Valley, 2005. He was kneeling in the dirt, his hands covered in the blood of his unit, while a dog that looked exactly like this one, stood over him barking at the sky. Max, that had been his name. Max hadn't been barking at the insurgents. He had been barking at the incoming mortars, sensing the change in air pressure before the human ear could register the whistle of death. The German shepherd in the cage suddenly stopped its slamming. It froze, its chest heaving, and looked directly at Franklin. For a second, the violence ceased, replaced by a devastating mutual recognition. The dog didn't growl. It let out a low, vibrating whine that sounded like a sob. Franklin felt a phantom pain in his chest, right where the shrapnel had scarred him. He realized why the dog was attacking. It wasn't madness. It was a duty that the animal couldn't turn off. It was protecting a perimeter that no longer existed, fighting a war that everyone else had forgotten. David stepped forward, the syringe poised. "Stop," Franklin said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command delivered with the authority of a man who had led men into hell and back. David hesitated the needle inches from the dog's flank. The officer looked at Franklin, seeing the scars on the man's neck, and the way he stood shoulders back, weight centered. He saw a soldier. "Get back, Franklin. The dog is dangerous," David stammered, but the conviction was gone from his voice. "It's got the sickness." "Look at it. It's trying to kill anything that moves." Franklin ignored him and walked right up to the bars. He didn't put his hand out to be sniffed. He didn't use a baby voice. He stood there, a silent monolith of understanding. He watched as a hawk circled high above the shelter, and as the bird's shadow crossed the cage, the dog erupted again, snapping at the air with bone-crushing force. David lunged forward to inject the sedative, but Franklin caught his wrist in a grip like a vice. The two men stood locked in a tense standoff, the dog screaming between them, the syringe, a silver needle of execution hovering in the air. "Look at his eyes," David Franklin hissed, his voice trembling with an emotion he hadn't felt in over a decade. "He's not looking at you. He's not looking at me. He's looking at the sky." David looked, really looked for the first time. He saw the dog's gaze track the hawk with mathematical precision. He saw the way the animal flinched at the sound of a distant truck backfiring, not out of fear, but as if it were expecting an explosion. The officer's grip on the syringe loosened. He didn't understand, but he felt the weight of Franklin's words. Franklin leaned his forehead against the cold, vibrating metal of the cage. The dog pressed its snout against the bars inches from Franklin's face. The growling died down into a series of short, sharp huffs. The animal's body was still wound tight, a spring ready to snap, but the mindless vacuum of rage in its eyes had been replaced by a question. It was the question every soldier asks when the battle is over, but the mind is still on the front lines. Is it safe? Am I done? The crowd was silent now. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Franklin reached out his fingers, slowly threading through the wire mesh to touch the coarse gray fur on the dog's forehead. The dog didn't bite. It closed its eyes and leaned into the touch, a long, shuddering breath escaping its lungs. It was a surrender, not to the needle, but to the only person who understood why it was fighting. Franklin looked at David, his eyes hard and uncompromising. "He's not die, Franklin," whispered his voice thick. "He's not crazy. He's just still in the sandbox." David looked at the blood on his arm, then at the dog, and finally at the man who had appeared out of the mountains like a ghost. He slowly lowered the syringe. "What do you want me to do?" David asked, the professional mask finally slipping. "I can't just let him go. He's a liability. He's a killer." Franklin didn't take his hand off the dog. He felt the animal's heart racing against its ribs, a frantic drumbeat of trauma. He looked at the horizon where the peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains stood like silent sentinels. "He's not a killer," Franklin said, his voice echoing in the sudden stillness of the morning. "He's a soldier who was left behind. And I'm taking him home." He turned back to the dog, his eyes softening for the first time in 15 years. The dog looked up at him, its ears slowly beginning to rise, searching Franklin's face for the next command. Franklin whispered under his breath so low that only the dog could hear. "It's okay, Max. The sky is clear. No more incoming. No more incoming." The hook was set. The man who had spent a decade and a half trying to forget the war had just invited it back into his life, bound in gray fur and trauma. As David began to unlock the cage with trembling hands, Franklin knew that the battle hadn't ended, it had just shifted terrain. The dog wasn't just a pet, it was a mirror of his own shattered soul, and together they were either going to find peace or be consumed by the fire that still burned in both of them. Franklin felt the dog's weight lean against the gate, ready to step out into a world it didn't understand, led by a man who was just as lost. The backyard of the relief center was a desolate stretch of packed earth and dying weeds, enclosed by a towering fence of rusted chain link and coils of razor-sharp concertina wire. The morning sun struggled to pierce through a thick layer of gray clouds, casting a pale, sickly light over the scene. The air was cold and carried the metallic tang of old blood and the sharp scent of industrial disinfectant. David stood a few feet away from the cage, his face pale and his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage that was already beginning to bloom with a dark, wet red. His breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes fixed on the gray-furred creature that crouched in the corner of the pen, a low, rhythmic growl vibrating in its chest like a failing engine. The sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel broke the oppressive silence. Jared, the director of the center, approached with the measured, heavy gait of a man who had spent too many years wearing a badge. He was a broad-shouldered man with a jaw like a slab of granite and eyes that had seen the worst of humanity in the city before he retired to this quiet mountain outpost. He stopped beside David, his gaze sweeping over the bloody bandage before settling on Franklin, who remained motionless, his hand still pressed against the cold steel of the cage. Jared's presence shifted the air, bringing with it a sense of rigid authority and the cold pragmatism of a man used to making hard choices. Jared did not look at the dog first. He looked at Franklin. He saw a man who looked like he had been carved out of the mountain itself, rough, silent, and carrying a weight that didn't belong to the civilian world. Jared's voice was a low rumble, devoid of warmth. He told David to go inside and get his arm cleaned up properly before he bled out on the dirt. David hesitated, his anger still simmering beneath the surface, but one look from Jared sent him retreating toward the main building. When the door clicked shut, Jared turned his full attention to Franklin, his eyes narrowing as he took in the stranger's protective stance over the animal. Jared gestured toward the dog, which had bared its teeth at the movement. He called the animal a lost cause, a liability that should have been put down the moment it crossed the state line. He spoke of the reports, the 3 men it had bitten, the way it had nearly killed a handler in Texas, and the sheer, unadulterated rage that seemed to drive its every instinct. Jared's voice grew harder as he explained that this wasn't a pet. It was a broken weapon that had forgotten how to distinguish between friend and foe. He reached for the heavy iron bolt on the gate, his intention clear to move the animal to the isolation unit for its final injection. Franklin didn't move. He didn't even blink. He spoke for the first time in hours, his voice sounding like 2 stones grinding together. He told Jared that the dog wasn't broken, just misaligned. He pointed out the specific scars on the animal's flanks, not from fights with other dogs but from shrapnel and high-velocity impacts. He noted the way the dog's ears twitched at the sound of a distant truck, backfiring a reaction that wasn't fear, but a Pavlovian response to the sound of incoming fire. Franklin's observations were clinical, precise, and filled with a depth of knowledge that no ordinary drifter should possess. Jared stopped, his hand hovering over the latch. He studied Franklin with a new intensity, his law enforcement instincts screaming that there was more to this man than the tattered coat and the silent demeanor. He asked Franklin who he thought he was coming into his facility and telling him how to manage a dangerous animal. The tension between the 2 men was a physical thing, a cord stretched to the point of snapping. The wind picked up, whistling through the barbed wire, sounding like a choir of ghosts. Franklin felt the old ghosts rising within him, the memories of sand heat, and the brotherhood of fur and blood he had tried so hard to bury. The silence lasted for what felt like an eternity. Franklin's hand tightened on the wire, until the metal bit into his palm. He looked Jared straight in the eye, his gaze unwavering, stripping away the layers of the recluse he had pretended to be for 15 years. He felt the words clawing at his throat, breaking through the wall of silence he had built to protect himself from the world. His voice was a rasp thick with a history of commands, shouted over the roar of helicopters and the staccato of gunfire. He told Jared that he was the one who had trained them. He told him he knew the language the dog spoke, a language of duty, sacrifice, and the kind of trauma that never truly heals. Then the 2 words fell from his lips heavy as lead. Canine. The air seemed to freeze. Jared, who had seen his share of canine units in the city, recognized the tone immediately. It wasn't just a claim. It was an identity. It was the way Franklin stood, the way he calculated the dog's movements, and the way he didn't fear the teeth that were inches from his throat. Jared saw the shadow of the soldier behind the man, the ghost of a handler who had lost his partner and had been wandering in the wilderness ever since. The skepticism in Jared's eyes didn't vanish, but it was replaced by a grim respect. Jared took a step back, his hand falling away from the latch. He looked at the dog, which had gone strangely still at the sound of Franklin's voice. It wasn't the silence of submission, but the silence of recognition. The animal's head was tilted, its nostrils flaring, as it caught a scent not of fear, but of someone who belonged to the same world of shadows and sirens. Jared looked back at Franklin and asked him what he proposed to do. He warned him that if the dog lashed out again, there would be no more chances, no more talking. It would be over. Franklin didn't ask for tools, muzzles, or sedatives. He told Jared that the dog didn't need more noise or more pain. He requested one thing: absolute silence. He explained that the world was too loud for a soul that was still trapped in a war zone. He needed the yard, cleared the doors shut, and the constant chatter of the center to stop. He wanted to strip away the chaos until there was nothing left but the two of them and the quiet. Jared, despite every protocol he had ever followed, nodded slowly. He signaled for the other staff members to stay inside and retreated toward the porch, watching from a distance. Franklin stepped into the cage. He didn't use a leash. He didn't use a command. He simply sat down in the dirt 3 feet away from the animal that everyone else called a monster. He closed his eyes and let his breathing slow, matching the rhythm of the wind. The dog lunged its teeth, snapping inches from Franklin's throat, but the man didn't flinch. He remained as still as a statue, a beacon of calm in a storm of fur and fury. Slowly, the dog's growl began to fade. It circled him, sniffing the air, its movements hesitant and confused. For the first time in a decade and a half, Franklin wasn't running from his past. He was using it to save a life that was just as broken as his own. The sun was a white-hot hammer, beating against the anvil of the New Mexico desert. The air was thick with the scent of parched earth sagebrush and the metallic tang of the chain-link fence that separated two restless souls. Franklin sat in the center of the dusty yard, his presence a quiet defiance against the oppressive heat. He had chosen a weathered, 3-legged wooden stool for this task. It was an unstable thing, requiring his constant focus and core strength to remain upright. It was a physical manifestation of his internal state, a man balanced on the edge of collapse, yet refusing to fall. He was positioned exactly 3 meters from the enclosure. It was a distance calculated by years of experience, a boundary between safety and the strike zone of a killer. Franklin did not look at the beast. He did not offer words of comfort or hollow promises of treats. Instead, he pulled a tattered, leather-bound book from his pocket and opened it to a random page. His eyes traced the ink, but his mind was tuned to the rhythmic panting and the low guttural vibration emanating from the shadows of the kennel. Inside the cage, the dog, now known as Wolf, was a whirlwind of black and tan fury. His muscles were corded like steel cables under a coat that had lost its luster to stress and neglect. Every time Franklin shifted his weight, Wolf would launch himself at the fence. The sound of teeth snapping against galvanized steel echoed through the yard like a series of small explosions. The dog's eyes were not those of a domestic pet. They were the eyes of a soldier who had seen too much, reflecting a world where every hand held a stone and every voice was a threat. Wolf's aggression was a masterpiece of trauma. He lunged with such force that the entire fence shuddered, the metal groaning under the impact of 60 pounds of concentrated rage. He was fighting the ghosts of the men who had beaten him, the handlers who had discarded him, and the cold loneliness of the pound. He barked until his throat was raw, a harsh, jagged sound that tore through the silence of the desert afternoon. Yet the man on the stool remained unmoved. Franklin was a statue of salt and sinew, his gaze fixed firmly on the yellowed pages of his book. Hours bled into one another. The shadows of the scrub brush lengthened across the cracked earth, stretching out like the fingers of a reaching hand. The heat did not dissipate. It merely changed its character, becoming a heavy, suffocating blanket. Franklin's shirt was long since soaked with sweat, the fabric clinging to his back, but he did not wipe his brow. He did not reach for the water bottle at his feet. He was engaged in a war of attrition, a battle where the only weapon was patience, and the only victory was the absence of a fight. He knew what Wolf was feeling. He knew the frantic electric surge of adrenaline that made the heart feel like it was going to burst through the ribcage. He knew the hypervigilance that turned every rustle of wind into a potential ambush. Franklin had spent 15 years trying to drown those same feelings in bottles of cheap whiskey and the silence of the wilderness. Now he was offering that silence to the dog. He was providing a constant, unchanging point in a world that had always been chaotic for the animal. By the 4th hour, the intensity of the attacks began to wane. The lunges became less frequent, the barks turning into ragged coughs. Wolf was reaching the end of his physical tether. His legs trembled as he stood his ground, his head low, saliva dripping from his jowls into the dirt. He was confused. This man did not shout. This man did not strike back. This man did not even acknowledge his existence. The lack of a reaction was more terrifying to the dog than any blow could have been. It stripped away his purpose. If there was no enemy to fight, what was he? Wolf retreated to the back of the kennel, his chest heaving. He watched Franklin with a mixture of suspicion and a new flickering curiosity. He paced a small circle, his claws clicking against the concrete floor of the run. Finally, with a long, shuddering sigh, the dog's back legs gave out. He did not sit. He collapsed onto his side, his breath coming in short, jagged bursts. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling high above in the turquoise sky. Franklin felt the shift in the air before he saw it. The tension that had been pulled taut between them for hours finally snapped. He didn't move his head, but he allowed his peripheral vision to take in the sight of the fallen warrior. The dog wasn't defeated. He was spent. The ghosts hadn't left him, but they were tired of screaming for a moment. Franklin slowly, deliberately turned a page in his book. The crisp sound of the paper was the only noise in the yard. It was a signal of normalcy, a domestic sound in a theater of war. He began to speak. It wasn't the soft, cooing voice people used for puppies. It was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to come from deep within his chest. He wasn't speaking English. The words were sharp, guttural, and carried a rhythmic authority. They were the sounds of a forgotten tongue, the language of the handlers who had first trained the line from which Wolf had descended. He spoke of the wind, the dust, and the long road home, weaving the German words into a tapestry of sound that bypassed the dog's fear and went straight to his instinct. Wolf's ears twitched. One, then the other pivoted toward the man. He didn't growl. He didn't rise. But his eyes, those amber pools of trauma, widened. He recognized the cadence. He recognized the commands hidden within the narrative, higher sits Platz. They were ghosts of a different kind, echoes of a time before the pain when he had a purpose and a pack. The dog's tail gave a single, almost imperceptible thump against the ground. Franklin closed the book. He didn't look back as he stood up, his joints popping from the long hours of stillness. He picked up his stool and began to walk toward the gate, his footsteps steady on the gravel. He didn't check to see if Wolf was watching. He knew he was. As he reached the exit, he whispered one final word into the cooling air, a word that was both a promise and a command. The dance of patience had ended for the day, but the bridge between two broken worlds had finally begun to take shape in the shadows of the New Mexico twilight. The sun was dipping low over the New Mexico horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the dusty floor of the shelter office. Franklin sat at the scarred wooden desk, the silence of the room punctuated only by the distant rhythmic barking of the other dogs and the hum of an old refrigerator in the corner. He was staring at his own calloused hands, still feeling the phantom weight of the book he had been reading to Wolf earlier. The air was thick, with the scent of pine cleaner and stale coffee, a sterile mask for the desperation that lived within these walls. The orange light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, making the small, cramped space feel like an underwater tomb. Meredith stepped into the room, her presence announced by the soft creak of the floorboards. Her scrub top was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many late nights and too little hope. She wasn't carrying her usual medical kit or a tray of vaccinations. Instead, she held a translucent plastic folder, its edges frayed and stained, with what looked like dried mud and old grease. She didn't say anything at first, just walked over and dropped the file onto the desk in front of Franklin. The slap of the plastic against the wood sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Franklin looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. Meredith leaned against the filing cabinet, crossing her arms tightly as if trying to hold herself together. She told him she had found it in the bottom of a box of intake forms from the massive county seizure, mislabeled and nearly thrown out with the trash. Her voice was thin, vibrating with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. Franklin reached out his fingers, brushing the cool, grimy plastic. Inside was a stack of official-looking documents, some bearing the unmistakable embossed seal of the Department of Defense. His heart skipped a beat, a cold sensation spreading from his chest to his fingertips. This wasn't the paperwork for a common stray. This was a record of service. He pulled the first page out with hands that had begun to tremble. It wasn't a name at the top of the page, it was a serial number. W442. The breed was listed as Belgian Malinois, followed by a series of physical specifications that read more like the blueprints for a weapon than the description of a living creature. Date of birth, the 12th of June 2018. As Franklin scanned the lines, the world outside the office seemed to fade away. Wolf wasn't just a dog with a bad temperament. He was a military working dog, a graduate of the elite 341st Training Squadron at Lackland Air Force Base. He was a specialist in explosive detection and patrol, a creature bred, born, and honed for the highest stakes of human conflict. The pages detailed 2 full tours of duty in the most volatile regions of the world. Kandahar, the Helmand Province. There were notes from his primary handlers, men who spoke of W442's courage under fire, his unwavering focus during midnight raids, and his uncanny ability to sense danger before the electronic sensors even tripped. He had been a guardian of the front lines, a silent partner to men who walked through the valley of the shadow of death. He had detected IEDs that would have vaporized entire squads. He had chased down combatants in the dead of night, moving like a ghost through the desert scrub. And then, at the bottom of the final service record, was the date of his honorable discharge, October 2023. The next few pages were harder to read, the ink blurred as if by dampness or neglect. They weren't official military records, but the jagged, hasty notes of a local animal control officer. After his discharge, W442, now dubbed Wolf by some bureaucratic whim, had been adopted by a civilian through a veteran assistance program designed to find homes for retired K-9s. The man's name was recorded in a blocky, uncaring script, but Franklin barely saw it. What he saw were the incident reports. The dog had struggled to adapt to the quiet. The loud noises of the city, the slamming of car doors, the sudden movements of strangers, all of it triggered the combat instincts that had been drilled into his very marrow. He wasn't being aggressive. He was still at war. Instead of the therapy, specialized training, and patience a war hero deserved, Wolf had found himself in the hands of a coward. The reports hinted at disciplinary measures that were nothing short of torture. The owner had tried to break the dog's spirit when the PTSD caused him to cower or growl in his sleep. There were mentions of heavy chains used to restrain him in a garage, of being left in the scorching New Mexico sun without water, as a form of toughening up. The physical marks Franklin had seen on the dog's ribs, the jagged scars and the slight hitch in his gait, now had a horrific source, a heavy-toed boot and a length of rebar. The final report was the shortest and the most devastating. The owner had called the shelter, claiming the dog was broken and vicious, and demanded he be put down before dumping him in a night-drop kennel and vanishing. Franklin felt a cold, sharp anger crystallizing in his chest, a feeling so intense it threatened to choke him. It was a familiar feeling, one he had buried deep under years of isolation and silence. He looked at the photo clipped to the back of the file, a younger, leaner version of the dog in the yard, sitting tall and proud next to a soldier in desert camouflage. The dog's eyes in the photo weren't filled with the hollow shadows of the present. They were bright, alert, and full of a devastatingly pure sense of duty. He was wearing a tactical vest, looking like the soldier he was. He realized then why the dog had responded to the German commands earlier that day. It wasn't just about the language. It was the memory of a life where he had been respected, where he had been part of a team, where his skills meant the difference between life and death. Wolf wasn't a problem to be solved. He was a brother in arms who had been left behind on the battlefield of civilian life. Franklin looked at his own hands again, noticing how they shook. He wasn't just looking at a dog's file. He was looking at a mirror. The abandonment, the misunderstanding of his trauma, the world's desire to simply discard what it no longer knew how to fix it, was all there on those stained pages. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the floor like a cry of pain. Meredith looked at him, her eyes searching his face for a reaction, but Franklin didn't say a word. He couldn't. The lump in his throat was too large. He tucked the file under his arm and walked out of the office, his stride purposeful and heavy. The air outside had turned crisp as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep violet and bruised orange. He walked past the main kennel block, ignored the frantic barking of the other dogs, and headed straight for the isolation yard where Wolf was kept. Wolf was standing by the chain-link fence, a dark, rigid silhouette against the fading light. He didn't growl this time. He didn't even bare his teeth. He just watched, his head tilted slightly to the side, his ears swiveling to catch the sound of Franklin's boots on the gravel. Franklin stopped a few feet away and knelt down, the sharp stones biting into his knees. He didn't try to touch the fence or invade the dog's space. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, airtight pouch of dried liver, the high-value treats he saved for the most difficult, most broken cases. He pulled out a piece of the treat and slid it carefully through the bottom of the wire mesh, his fingers inches away from the dog's powerful jaws. Wolf didn't move for a long time. He sniffed the air, his nostrils flared, assessing the scent of the man and the offering. Slowly, with a cautious, trembling dignity that broke Franklin's heart, the dog leaned forward and took the treat, his teeth clicking softly against the metal. Franklin leaned his forehead against the cold, vibrating wire of the fence, closing his eyes. He spoke in a whisper, his voice thick with a resolve that transcended his own years of pain. He wasn't just a trainer anymore. He was a protector. He whispered into the cooling night air, promising the dog that the cycle of betrayal ended here. He promised that no one would ever hurt him again, and that they would find their way back from the darkness together. "I will not let them kill you, partner," he vowed. The silence was shattered by the heavy clank of the main entrance door. The sound of polished leather soles against the grit of the hallway floor was unmistakable. David approached with a stride that radiated a cold, bureaucratic triumph. He was dressed in a sharp, charcoal gray suit that seemed to repel the gloom of the facility, and in his hand, he held a single sheet of paper with the official seal of the county magistrate. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of Franklin, a thin, satisfied smile playing on his lips. He didn't look at the dog. He looked only at the man who had dared to stand in his way. David held the paper up, the crisp parchment crinkling in the damp air. "This is it, Franklin," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of any empathy. "The board has reviewed the incident reports. Given the level of aggression and the perceived risk to public safety, the stay of execution has been denied. You have exactly 7 days. Next Monday at 8 in the morning, I will be the one to sign the final authorization for the lethal injection. I suggest you spend the week saying your goodbyes instead of wasting more of the taxpayers' money on a lost cause." Franklin felt a surge of heat crawl up his neck, a raw, burning anger that threatened to break his composure. He didn't look at the paper. He kept his gaze locked on David's eyes, seeing the deep-seated fear that the man tried to mask with authority. David wasn't just following protocol. He was seeking a personal victory over a creature that reminded him of his own vulnerability. "You are in such a hurry to kill something you don't understand," Franklin replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You think a needle makes you powerful, David. It just makes you a coward who's afraid of what he can't control." David's smile flickered a momentary crack in his armor, of professional indifference. He stepped closer, the scent of expensive cologne clashing with the musk of the kennels. "I'm afraid of nothing," he hissed. "I am simply cleaning up a mess that should have been handled the moment that monster drew blood. 7 days, Franklin. Don't be late on Monday. It's a very quick process." With a sharp turn, David marched back toward the offices, the rhythmic clicking of his shoes sounding like the ticking of a countdown clock. Franklin leaned his forehead against the cold metal of the gate, closing his eyes as the weight of the deadline crashed down on him. 7 days. It was an impossible window for a dog that still viewed every human gesture as a prelude to a strike. He felt a light touch on his shoulder and turned to see Meredith standing there. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her hair pulled back in a messy, hurried knot. She held a thick legal binder close to her chest, her fingers trembling slightly. "I've been up all night, Franklin," she whispered, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "I went through the state wildlife statutes and the municipal codes for dangerous breeds. There is a loophole. It's a thin one, but it's there." She opened the binder, pointing to a highlighted section under the Dangerous Animal Transfer Protocol. If a classified animal can demonstrate a level of social compliance, specifically the ability to be handled, leashed, and muzzled without showing predatory aggression, the court can stay the execution in favor of a permanent transfer to a high-security sanctuary. Franklin looked at the words, but his heart sank. The sanctuary was a dream, but the requirements were a nightmare. To be leashed and muzzled meant Wolf had to surrender his only means of defense. He had to trust a human enough to let them bind his jaws and control his movement. To a dog that had been tortured and trapped, a muzzle wasn't a safety tool. It was a symbol of the end. It was the last thing they did to him before the pain started in his past life. Meredith pulled a heavy-duty black basket muzzle from her bag and set it on the metal table between them. The plastic was thick, the leather straps reinforced with steel rivets. It looked more like a piece of medieval armor than a training tool. "If we can get him to wear this and walk on a lead through the main yard without him lunging at the staff, the judge will have to grant the transfer," she said. "But Franklin, we have to prove it by Sunday evening." Franklin reached out and touched the cold plastic of the muzzle. He thought of the scars on Wolf's snout, the jagged lines where wire had once bitten deep into the flesh. Every time Wolf saw something near his face, he went into a defensive frenzy. To him, this object was a cage for his soul. "You're asking me to ask him for the one thing he doesn't have," Franklin said softly. "Trust. He thinks the world is out to kill him, and now I have to prove him right by putting this on him." He looked back at the enclosure. Wolf had stopped pacing. The dog was watching them, his head lowered, his body a coiled spring of muscle and suspicion. He knew something had changed. He could smell the tension, the fear, and the scent of the new, strange object on the table. Franklin knew that if he failed, he wouldn't just be losing a dog. He would be failing the silent promise he had made to every broken soul he had ever tried to save. "I'm not going home," Franklin announced, his voice flat and resolute. Meredith looked at him confused. "What do you mean? The shelter closes in an hour." Franklin grabbed his keys and a heavy wool blanket from the corner. "I'm moving my truck to the perimeter of the isolation yard. I'm staying here, 24 hours a day. If he only has 7 days, then I'm giving him every second of those 7 days. He needs to see me when he wakes up, when he eats, and when the sun goes down. He needs to realize that I'm the only thing standing between him and that needle." He walked out to the parking lot, the first drops of rain beginning to splatter against the asphalt. He backed his old battered Ford truck up until the tailgate was inches from the outer fence of Wolf's Run. He began hauling his gear, a sleeping bag, a cooler of raw meat, a gallon of water, and a stack of old training manuals. The rain began to fall in earnest, now a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof of the truck that drowned out the distant sounds of the city. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, burying the world in a deep, suffocating blue, Franklin climbed into the bed of his truck and pulled the blanket around his shoulders. He sat cross-legged, facing the fence. On the other side, barely 3 feet away, Wolf sat in the shadows of his kennel. The dog's eyes glowed in the dark, 2 embers of defiance in the gloom. The night grew cold, the wind whipping the rain under the edges of the truck's canopy. Franklin didn't move. He didn't try to talk to the dog or offer him food. He simply existed in the same space, a silent sentinel in the dark. He watched the way Wolf's ears moved, the way the dog shifted his weight, the way he eventually laid down his head, resting on his paws, but his eyes never truly closing. They were 2 predators in the night, both scarred, both discarded by a world that had no use for their intensity. Franklin felt the ache in his bones and the heavy pull of exhaustion, but he forced himself to stay awake. He looked at the muzzle, resting on the seat beside him, its silhouette a grim reminder of the challenge ahead. He knew that the next 168 hours would be a descent into a private hell for both of them. He would have to push Wolf to the edge of his sanity to save his life. The rain turned into a downpour, the water cascading off the fence in shimmering sheets. Franklin reached out a hand, letting the cold water run over his palm, and then he rested his hand against the wire mesh. He didn't move it toward the dog. He just left it there, an open invitation in the middle of the storm. Inside the cage, Wolf let out a long, low huff of breath, a sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a sigh. The clock was ticking, the world was sleeping, and the battle for a life had officially begun. The fluorescent lights of the Oasis petroleum station hummed with a sickly, rhythmic buzz that grated against the silence of the midnight highway. It was a lonely, desolate place, a concrete island surrounded by an ocean of shifting desert sands and the infinite blackness of the Nevada sky. The air smelled of stale grease, ozone, and the sharp metallic tang of spilled gasoline. Franklin stood inside the narrow glass booth of an old-fashioned payphone, his large frame cramped within the transparent walls. The glass was etched with decades of grit and graffiti, blurring the world outside into a smear of yellow light and deep shadows. His fingers calloused and trembling slightly from a cocktail of exhaustion and adrenaline hovered over the keypad. He had memorized this number 15 years ago, a string of digits he had promised himself he would never dial again. The dial tone was a long, haunting drone that echoed the emptiness in his chest. Each beep as he pressed the buttons felt like a hammer blow against his resolve. He was breaking a vow of silence that had lasted a decade and a half, a self-imposed exile meant to punish a man who believed he didn't deserve to be heard. On the other side of the lot, his battered truck sat idling the engine, a low growl in the dark. In the back, he knew Wolf was watching those amber eyes, probably fixed on the flickering light of the station, waiting for the man who had become his only link to the living world. Franklin closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cold, grime-streaked glass. The plastic receiver was heavy in his hand, a relic of a world that had moved on without him. The line rang once, twice. A third time, the sound stretching out into the vastness of the American night. Franklin almost hung up his heart, hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Then there was a click. The static hissed a sea of white noise, and then a voice broke through, deep, gravelly, and weary with the weight of too many years. James. It was the voice of a man who had seen the same horrors. Franklin had a man who had survived the fire, only to be left with the ashes. James didn't say hello. He simply breathed into the receiver, a heavy, expectant sound that suggested he had been waiting for this call for a very long time. Franklin tried to speak, but his throat was a desert, his vocal cords seized by a decade of unspoken grief. James Franklin finally managed to rasp his voice, sounding foreign even to his own ears. "It's me." There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. He could picture James sitting in some dimly lit kitchen in Virginia, perhaps with a bottle of bourbon and a handgun on the table, the shadows of the past dancing on the walls. "I didn't think you were still alive," James finally replied, his voice devoid of judgment but heavy with a profound sadness. "I heard you went into the woods to die, Frank." "Why are you calling now? Why, after all this time?" Franklin gripped the cord of the phone, twisting the coiled plastic around his finger until it turned white. "I'm trying to save something, James. A dog. A Belgian Malinois named Wolf. He's like us. Broken. Angry. Ready for the needle." Franklin began to pour it out, the words tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed stream. He talked about the training, the 168 hours, the way the dog looked at him with the same haunting intensity he saw in the mirror every morning. But as he spoke, the conversation inevitably drifted back to the shadow that had followed him since the war. "I can't let him die," James Franklin whispered, his voice breaking. "I can't have another one on my hands. Not after Max. I killed him. I gave the order to pivot left into that clearing. I thought I saw a scout. I sent him right into the pressure plates. It was my arrogance, my failure as a lead. I've carried that every day for 15 years. I'm a failure, James. I'm a ghost trying to pretend I can still lead." The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of shock or grief. It was the silence of a man who had just heard a confession that was based on a fundamental lie. James let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, a jagged noise that cut through the static of the long-distance line. "You idiot, James," spat the sudden intensity of his voice, making Franklin flinch. "You arrogant, self-important son of a bitch. You think you're that powerful. You think you're the one who decides who lives and who dies in a godforsaken minefield. Franklin was stunned, his mouth hanging open as he stared out at the dark highway. James, I saw the blast. I gave the command, shut up and listen to me, Franklin. James roared, his voice cracking with a decade of suppressed frustration. You didn't kill Max. You didn't send him anywhere he didn't choose to go. I was there, Frank. I was 3 feet behind him. You gave the order to pivot left, yes. But Max saw the wire. He saw the tripcord that you missed because you were looking at the ridgeline. He knew if the squad moved left, we'd all be shredded. He didn't follow your order, Frank. He ignored it. He stepped right intentionally to trigger that first plate because he knew it was the only way to blow the chain and give us a gap to dive for cover. He didn't die because of your mistake. He died because he was a better man than all of us. He chose to be the shield. Franklin felt the world tilt. The ground beneath his boots seemed to liquefy the heavy weight of the last 15 years, suddenly shifting, unbalancing him. He leaned his weight against the phone box, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Max. He knew, Franklin whispered. He knew. James confirmed, his voice softening but remaining firm. He went out like a king, Frank. He saved me. He saved Miller. He saved you. And for 15 years you've been spitting on his sacrifice by calling it a failure. You've been living in a hole, blaming yourself for a man's finest hour. He didn't die because you were weak. He died because he was strong enough to love us more than his own life. The realization hit Franklin like a physical blow to the solar plexus. The image he had carried in his mind, the image of Max's body being tossed by the blast because of a botched command, shattered into 1,000 pieces. In its place rose a new image, Max, looking back one last time, eyes clear and resolute, stepping into the fire so his brothers could live. Franklin's eyes flooded with tears, hot and stinging, blurring the sight of his truck in the distance. All the years of isolation, the drinking, the silence, the refusal to look anyone in the eye, it had all been built on a foundation of dust. He hadn't been a murderer. He had been a survivor who refused to be saved. I have to go, James Franklin said, his voice trembling but possessing a new steel-like edge. He didn't wait for a response. He hung up the receiver, the plastic clacking loudly against the metal cradle. He stepped out of the booth, the cold desert air hitting him like a baptism. The wind howled across the flats, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. He looked toward his truck, where the silhouette of the dog was visible against the rear window. For the first time in over a decade, the crushing weight on his shoulders didn't feel like a leaden burden. It felt like a mantle. He walked across the cracked asphalt, his stride lengthening, his posture straightening. The flickering neon sign of the gas station cast long dancing shadows across his path. But he didn't look down. He looked straight at the truck. He wasn't saving Wolf to balance the scales of a debt that didn't exist. He wasn't training the dog to atone for a sin he hadn't committed. He was doing it because Max had died so that life could continue, and to let a soul like Wolf be extinguished would be the true betrayal of Max's sacrifice. Franklin reached the truck and climbed into the driver's seat. He didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he turned around and looked through the small glass pane into the bed of the truck. Wolf was standing now, his ears pricked, his gaze locked onto Franklin's. There was no growl this time, no baring of teeth. There was only a silent communication between two creatures who had both been living in the dark. Franklin reached out and placed his hand against the glass right where the dog's nose was pressed. "We're going to finish this," he whispered into the quiet cabin. "Not for me, for him." The engine roared to life, a powerful mechanical heartbeat in the silence of the Nevada night. Franklin shifted the truck into gear and pulled away from the Oasis petroleum station, the flickering lights fading in his rearview mirror. The road ahead was long and shrouded in darkness, but for the first time in 15 years, Franklin knew exactly where he was going. He wasn't running away from a ghost anymore. He was running toward a purpose. The 168 hours were no longer a countdown to an end, but a countdown to a beginning. As the truck sped into the blackness, the tears on Franklin's face dried in the wind, leaving behind a gaze that was as sharp and unforgiving as the desert itself. Franklin stood by the window of the small office, his silhouette cast long and jagged across the linoleum floor. He watched the first few drops of rain strike the glass thick and slow like oil. He knew what was coming. He had seen the way the animals had been acting all afternoon, the frantic pacing, the low, mournful howls that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the building. But no one was reacting as violently as the creature in the back room. The first true strike of lightning split the sky, a jagged white vein that illuminated the world in a blinding monochromatic flash. A second later, the thunder hit. It wasn't a rumble. It was an explosion, a concussive force that shook the windows in their frames. To the ears of a civilian, it was a storm. To Wolf, trapped in the darkness of his concrete-walled kennel, it was a mortar strike. It was the sound of the earth opening up to swallow the living. The sound that erupted from the back of the facility was not a bark. It was a raw, guttural scream of pure, unadulterated terror. Franklin didn't wait. He sprinted down the narrow hallway, his boots thudding against the floor in a frantic rhythm. When he reached the heavy iron door of the high-security kennel, he stopped, paralyzed for a split second by the sheer violence of the scene before him. Wolf was a blur of gray and black fur, a whirlwind of muscle and desperation. He was throwing his entire 100-pound weight against the chain-link gate of his cage, the metal groaning and warping under the impact. His paws were raw blood smeared against the silver wire where he had been clawing at the exit. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown out, until they were nothing but bottomless black pits of panic. He was snapping at the air, his teeth clashing together with a sound like dry wood snapping, fighting an invisible enemy that only he could see. Franklin reached for the bolt of the cage. His hand was shaking, the old tremors from his time in the valley returning with a vengeance. He knew the protocol. He should call for backup. He should use the tranquilizer pole. He should stay on the other side of the wire for his own safety. But as another bolt of lightning turned the room white, he saw the dog's chest heaving the frantic, shallow breaths of a creature whose heart was on the verge of exploding. He didn't see a dangerous animal. He saw a soldier lost in the fog of war, abandoned in a foxhole while the world burned. The screech of the iron bolt sliding back was lost in the next roar of thunder. Franklin stepped inside the cage. He didn't bring a weapon. He didn't bring a leash. He stepped into the confined space and closed the door behind him, locking himself in with a predator that was currently out of its mind with PTSD-induced rage. Wolf spun around instantly. The dog's lips pulled back, revealing long ivory canines, slick with saliva and blood. A low, vibrating growl started deep in his chest, a sound so primal it seemed to vibrate through Franklin's own bones. The dog crouched, his haunches coiled like a spring, his gaze locked onto Franklin's throat. To Wolf, the man wasn't a caretaker anymore. He was a shadow in the dark. He was the enemy coming to finish the job that the bombs had started. Franklin didn't retreat. He didn't raise his hands to defend himself. Instead, he slowly sank to his knees on the cold, wet concrete. He made himself small, vulnerable, his head bowed. He could feel the heat radiating off the dog's body, could hear the frantic clicking of claws as Wolf circled him, looking for the right angle to strike. The dog lunged, a mass of fur and fury, pinning Franklin against the rear wall. Franklin felt the crushing weight of the animal's paws on his shoulders, the sharp pressure of teeth grazing the skin of his neck. "I'm right here," Franklin whispered, his voice cracking, barely audible over the torrential rain drumming against the corrugated metal roof. "I'm not going anywhere. I've got you." The dog's jaws were millimeters from his jugular. Franklin could feel the hot, ragged breath against his skin. He didn't flinch. He let the tears fall hot and stinging as 15 years of repressed agony finally clawed its way to the surface. He began to talk, not to the dog, but to the ghosts that had followed them both into this cage. He told Wolf about the day in the Kunar province, when the sky had turned to fire. He spoke about Max, the kid with the lopsided grin who had pushed Franklin into a drainage ditch just as the RPG hit their Humvee. "I watched him burn." Wolf Franklin sobbed his hands, finally reaching out not to push the dog away but to gently cup the sides of the animal's scarred face. "I watched him burn, and I couldn't move. I was so scared that I stayed in that ditch while he screamed for his mother. And James lost everything. Because I wasn't fast enough with the suppressive fire. I'm a coward. I've been running for 15 years because I can't look at a mirror without seeing a man who let his brothers die." The dog froze. The growl didn't stop, but it changed in pitch, shifting from a threat to a confused whimper. Wolf's eyes searched Franklin's, looking for the lie, but there was none. There was only the shared, jagged language of trauma. For the first time, the dog saw the man's pain a mirror of his own shattered soul. The teeth retracted. The tension in the dog's neck began to melt away, muscle by muscle. Another crack of thunder, closer this time, made the entire building shudder. Wolf flinched violently, his body convulsing in a fresh wave of panic, but instead of attacking, he did something that broke what was left of Franklin's heart. The dog buried his head into the crook of Franklin's neck, his heavy body leaning entirely into the man for support. He wasn't a predator anymore. He was a drowning soul reaching for a life raft. Franklin wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck, pulling him close, shielding the animal's ears with his palms to dull the sound of the storm. They sat there on the blood-flecked concrete, two broken veterans of different species huddled together in the dark. Franklin rocked back and forth, weeping openly now, his face buried in Wolf's fur. He felt the dog's heart rate slowly begin to synchronize with his own, the frantic drumming slowing to a steady, rhythmic beat. The storm raged for hours, a relentless assault of wind and water that tore at the world outside, but inside the cage, a strange and fragile peace had taken hold. Franklin didn't let go, even when his limbs grew numb and the cold of the floor seeped into his marrow. He stayed until his voice went hoarse from whispering stories of home of green fields and quiet nights, promising the dog a world that didn't involve the sound of falling bombs. Eventually, the exhaustion of the emotional purge took its toll. Franklin's head lolled back against the wall, his eyes fluttering shut as the adrenaline finally left his system. He fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the first real rest he had known in over a decade. His arms still locked around the animal that had once tried to kill him. Hours later, the first pale, watery light of dawn began to filter through the high windows of the kennel. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that was damp and silent. Franklin stirred his muscles, screaming in protest as he tried to shift his weight. He reached out to pat the spot where Wolf had been resting, but his hand hit nothing but cold concrete. He sat up abruptly, his eyes snapping open. The cage door, which had been weakened by Wolf's earlier assault and the warping of the metal during the storm, hung precariously on a single twisted hinge. It had been pushed outward, swaying slightly in the cool morning breeze that drifted through the facility. The kennel was empty. Franklin scrambled to his feet, his heart racing. He stumbled out of the cage and toward the back exit of the shelter, which had been blown open by the gale. Outside the Nevada desert was waking up the sand, still dark and heavy with moisture. He saw them then, a trail of large, purposeful paw prints leading away from the building, cutting across the mud, and heading straight toward the dense fog-shrouded tree line of the national forest that bordered the town. Wolf hadn't been captured by the storm. He had been set free by it. An old soldier and a broken beast hunted by the law and the ghosts of their shared past find themselves at the edge of a literal and metaphorical abyss. In the dark heart of an abandoned mine, Franklin must choose between his own safety and the life of a creature the world has deemed a monster, leading to a sacrifice that forces his greatest enemy to finally see the truth. The Sonora mine was a skeletal ruin, a jagged scar carved into the side of the mountain that overlooked the Nevada desert. Its wooden supports were rotted husks, and the iron tracks that once carried ore now pointed like accusing fingers into the thick, swirling fog. The air here was thin and tasted of old rust and damp earth. On this desolate peak, the wind didn't just blow. It shrieked through the hollow shafts, sounding like the tormented cries of those who had long since been forgotten. Franklin climbed the steep incline, his lungs burning with every breath. His hands were raw, scraped bloody by the shale and the biting cold. Below him, the faint, rhythmic pulse of blue and red lights cut through the mist. David and his team were coming. They weren't coming to rescue. They were coming to finish what they had started. They saw a killer in the woods, a beast that had escaped justice. Franklin only saw a friend who was terrified and alone. A sharp, guttural yelp echoed from the darkness ahead, followed by the terrifying sound of shifting stone and grinding metal. Franklin froze his heart, hammering against his ribs. He pushed forward, ignoring the protests of his aging joints, until he reached the mouth of a collapsed ventilation shaft. The ground had given way, leaving a jagged fissure that dropped 10 feet into a pit of jagged debris and rusted machinery. At the bottom of the pit, Wolf was pinned. A massive slab of granite had slid during the storm, trapping the dog's rear leg against a twisted section of an old mining cart. The animal was a mess of matted fur and dried blood. His breathing was shallow, coming in ragged, wet gasps. When the beam of Franklin's flashlight hit him, Wolf bared his teeth, a low defensive growl vibrating in his chest, but his eyes told a different story. They were wide, glazed with shock and unbearable pain. Suddenly, the crunch of gravel sounded behind Franklin. He spun around to find David standing 10 yards away, his high-powered rifle leveled at the pit. The officer's face was a mask of cold determination, his eyes narrowed behind the scope. The police backup was still a few minutes behind, but David had found his target. "Step away," Franklin David commanded, his voice as hard as the mountain stone. "It's over. That animal is a public threat. I'm ending this now before he hurts anyone else." Franklin didn't hesitate. He stepped into the line of fire, placing his body directly between the barrel of the gun and the trapped dog. "You'll have to shoot through me, David. He's not a monster. He's a soldier who never got to come home. Just like us." "He's a dog, Franklin, a dangerous one," David yelled, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Move, or I'll have you charged with obstruction." "I have a job to do." "Then do it," Franklin whispered, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "But look at him first. Look at what we've done to him." For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the wind and the clicking of the cooling rifle barrel. David's eyes flickered from Franklin to the pit. He saw the dog not as a predator, but as a broken creature struggling for its last breath. He saw the way Wolf's head dropped in exhaustion, the fight finally leaving him. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, David's aim wavered. Franklin didn't wait for a change of heart. He turned and began to scramble down the treacherous side of the fissure. The rocks shifted under his weight, sending small avalanches of dust and pebbles cascading onto the dog below. Wolf snapped at the air, his instincts screaming that he was being cornered, but Franklin kept talking in a low, rhythmic hum, the same tone he had used in the kennel during the storm. "Easy, boy, easy. I've got you," Franklin murmured as he reached the bottom. The space was cramped, smelling of oil and ancient dust. He could feel the heat radiating off Wolf's feverish body. The dog's leg was badly mangled, the bone likely shattered where the iron had clamped down. Franklin knelt in the dirt, ignoring the sharp edges of the scrap metal pressing into his knees. He reached for his waist, unbuckling his heavy leather belt. It was an old, sturdy thing worn soft by years of use. He knew he couldn't lift the stone alone, and he couldn't leave Wolf here while he went for help. The mine was unstable. Another shift would bury them both. He began to work, his movements slow and deliberate. He used a piece of discarded timber as a lever, bracing it against the mining cart. With a grunt of pure adrenaline-fueled strength, he heaved. The stone groaned, moving just enough for Franklin to slide Wolf's leg free. The dog let out a piercing shriek of agony that echoed up the shaft, a sound so primal it made David, still watching from above, flinch. I know, Franklin panted, sweat dripping from his forehead despite the cold. He quickly wrapped his belt around Wolf's chest and under his forelegs, fashioning a makeshift harness. He looped the end of the belt around his own shoulder and arm, tethering the 40-kilogram animal to his own body. The climb back up was a descent into a private hell. Franklin had to use his fingernails to claw into the frozen earth and crumbling rock, all while the dead weight of the semi-conscious dog pulled him backward. Every inch was a battle against gravity and his own failing strength. His muscles screamed, his tendons felt like they were snapping, and the copper taste of blood filled his mouth. Wolf was silent now, his head resting heavily against Franklin's shoulder, his warm breath huffing against the man's neck. It was a strange, intimate burden. Franklin felt every heartbeat of the animal, a frantic, thudding rhythm that matched his own. They were two broken things, trying to become whole, clawing their way out of the earth. Above them, David stood at the edge. He watched the struggle with a look of profound realization. He saw the blood on Franklin's hands, the way the old man refused to let go, even when his feet slipped, and he nearly fell back into the darkness. David saw a level of devotion that transcended logic, a bond forged in a fire he had forgotten existed. The sirens were closer, now the shadows of other officers appearing through the fog. David looked down at his rifle, then at the man and the dog, gasping for air, just a few feet below the rim. He reached out his hand not for his weapon but toward Franklin. "Give me your hand!" Frank David shouted over the wind. Franklin looked up, his vision blurring. He saw the hand, and for a second, he saw the young soldier David used to be, before the bitterness of the world had taken hold. He reached out, and David's grip closed around his wrist like a vice. With a powerful heave, David pulled them both over the edge and onto the solid, cold ground of the mountain path. Franklin collapsed his chest, heaving, his body shaking with exhaustion. Wolf lay beside him, the belt still binding them together. The dog was unconscious, but his chest moved in a steady, rhythmic pace. They were out. They were in the light. David stood over them, his rifle slung over his shoulder, the barrel pointing toward the ground. The other officers arrived, their flashlights cutting through the mist, but David held up a hand to stop them. "He's not a threat," David said, his voice quiet, but carrying a weight of finality. "He's a casualty. Get the vet unit up here. Now." Franklin reached out a trembling hand and rested it on Wolf's head. The dog's ears flickered, and he let out a long, low sigh, the tension finally leaving his battered frame. The fog began to lift, revealing the vast expanse of the valley below, bathed in the first golden rays of the morning sun. They were both covered in the grime of the underground, stained by the rust of the past and the blood of the present. But as the medics approached, and the chaos of the world returned, Franklin knew the darkness of the Sonora mine had been left behind. They had dragged each other out of the pit, and for the first time in years, the air felt clean. An old soldier finds a new mission, plus a broken dog finds a new pack, plus a long-lost brother returns, plus the ultimate healing. The sun began its slow ascent over the jagged peaks of the Sierra Nevada, casting a soft, honey-colored glow across the valley of the relief camp. This was not the harsh, blinding light of the desert that Franklin had known for so long, nor was it the suffocating darkness of the mine. It was a gentle dawn, the kind that promised nothing more than the quiet passage of time. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp pine needles and the faint, sweet aroma of brewing coffee from the main mess hall. Franklin stood on the porch of his small, timber-framed cabin, his boots clicking softly against the seasoned wood. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs without the rasping cough that had plagued him for years. The ghosts of the past were still there, but they had retreated to the periphery of his mind, no longer screaming for attention. Down in the yard, the dew-kissed grass sparkled like a field of fallen stars. The camp was waking up, but it was a rhythmic, peaceful awakening. This was the heart of the Warriors and Friends program, a sanctuary carved out of the wilderness for those whose wounds were not always visible. Franklin adjusted the sleeves of his flannel shirt, his hands once prone to tremors, now steady and calloused from honest work. He looked down at his feet, where a familiar shadow lay stretched across the porch boards. Wolf lay there, his thick fur catching the golden light. The dog was older now, his muzzle frosted with more gray than before, and his back left leg rested at a slightly awkward angle, a permanent reminder of the night the earth tried to swallow them whole. But his eyes, once wild and clouded with the frenzy of survival, were now clear and observant. He didn't need to pace or snarl anymore. He simply existed in the present, his tail thumping once, twice, against the wood as he sensed Franklin's gaze. Wolf was no longer a beast of burden or a weapon of war. He was a partner in the truest sense of the word. Franklin stepped down from the porch, his movement fluid. He walked toward a small fenced enclosure, where a young man sat on a low three-legged stool. The young soldier, barely 24, was named Silas. He wore a faded army jacket and sat with his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on a skittish, scarred German shepherd that huddled in the far corner of the pen. The dog was shivering, its ears pinned back, baring its teeth at the slightest movement. Franklin stopped at the gate, watching in silence. He saw him draw himself in Silas, the rigid posture, the aura of a man waiting for an explosion that never comes. Franklin leaned against the fence post, his voice low and grounding. He told Silas to lower his center of gravity and to stop looking the dog in the eye. He explained that for a creature that had only known betrayal, a direct gaze was a challenge, a threat of more pain. Franklin guided the young man through the three-legged stool method, a technique of presence rather than action. He told Silas to just be, to let his scent become part of the environment, until the dog realized that this human was not a predator but a fixed point in a chaotic world. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the enclosure began to melt. The German Shepherd stopped growling. It took a tentative step forward, its nose twitching. Franklin watched as Silas's own breathing slowed in sync with the animal's. It was a silent conversation, a bridge being built across a chasm of trauma. Franklin felt a profound sense of purpose. He wasn't just training dogs, he was teaching men how to feel safe in their own skin again. He was proof that the broken could be mended even if the seams remained visible. A cloud of dust appeared on the long dirt road leading into the camp. A dark blue pickup truck, its body caked in the grime of a long journey, rattled toward the cabin. Franklin felt a jolt of recognition, a flicker of an old memory. He straightened his back as the truck pulled to a stop. The engine cut out, leaving only the sound of the wind through the pines. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with silvering hair and a face etched with the lines of command and the weight of years. It was James. The two men stood 10 feet apart, the silence between them heavy, with 15 years of unspoken apologies and shared grief. James looked at Franklin, really looked at him, seeing the man who had disappeared into the shadows of Arizona and the man who had climbed back out. There were no words at first, none were adequate. James took a step forward, his eyes shimmering with a mixture of regret and relief. Franklin met him halfway. They didn't shake hands. They embraced a fierce, bone-crushing hug that bridged the gap of a decade and a half of silence. In that moment, the ghosts of their fallen brothers seemed to finally find rest. They sat on the porch steps later, mugs of steaming coffee in their hands. James spoke of the families of the men they had lost, of the letters he had kept, and of the way he had never stopped looking for Franklin. He told him that the military records had been cleared, that the incident in the desert was finally being seen for what it was, a tragedy of errors, not a failure of character. Franklin listened, but he realized that he no longer needed the world's validation to feel whole. The peace he had found wasn't in a file or a medal. It was in the rhythmic breathing of the dog at his side and the steady beat of his own heart. James looked at Wolf, who had moved to rest his head on Franklin's knee. The older man smiled, a genuine, tired smile. He remarked on how much the dog looked like the one they had lost in the valley all those years ago. Franklin shook his head slowly. He told James that this dog wasn't a ghost. He was a survivor. He told him how they had saved each other in the bowels of the earth, how the dog had given him a reason to crawl when his legs wouldn't work, and how, in return, he had given the dog a reason to trust again. As the sun climbed higher, painting the valley in vibrant greens and blues, James prepared to leave, promising to return with more veterans who needed what this camp offered. Franklin stood by the truck, watching his old friend drive away. He felt a lightness he hadn't known since he was a boy. The isolation was over. The hiding was done. He turned back toward his cabin where Wolf was waiting at the door, his ears perked, his tail wagging with a slow, contented rhythm. Franklin knelt down, burying his fingers in the thick, coarse fur of Wolf's neck. He looked out toward the distant, shimmering peaks of the mountains, the very place that had once been his prison and was now his backyard. A smile, slow and certain, spread across his face. He leaned in close to the dog's ear, his voice a soft, melodic whisper that carried on the mountain breeze. "We're home, partner," Franklin said, his heart finally still. "Finally home."